Hello, I'm Teeth Pop Tarts and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about my love for survival horror games, namely Resident Evil and Silent Hill. One of the basics to any great game, in my opinion, is a good story. A good story has well-developed characters and an interesting plot. Resident Evil was a trailblazer for early horror games and served as one of the first in the survival horror genre. The first survival horror game was Haunted House on the Atari 2600, and we'll talk about that game in another video. First, we should talk about what makes a survival horror game a survival horror game. A survival horror game is made with a definitive formula including survival aspects like limited items, full vulnerability, and a focus on puzzle-solving mechanics rather than fighting enemies. So to dive right into it, let's firstly talk about what I dictate to be good story writing in a survival horror game. The game, of course, needs the basic elements of being in a life or death situation, thus giving it the title of survival horror. In my ideal game, the player is dropped into some sort of town, city, or just some sort of usually populated environment. Then there's an outbreak or some sort of increasing evil that you have to fight through to save yourself or even the world. While I say this, I'm also a sucker for making the majority of the game story-based, almost to the point of there being symbolism around every corner, and you having to look for the pieces to the story to get the right ending. This is why I adore Silent Hill despite only playing through about half of the second game. Every enemy, puzzle, boss, and even character is a form of symbolism. I feel like even if your game isn't the best in visuals, you can still make up for it in the story aspect that will keep people around. Then again, I'm not the best person to use as a reference for good story, because I'm a sucker for an edgy story just for the sake of being edgy, usually. There's some lines even I won't cross. Now let's talk about limited items. Limited items are usually in the form of not having much ammo if there are guns, or a sparse amount of healing items. Having limited items makes the player strategize if using that herb right now will be beneficial or if they should save it for later in the game. This aspect relates to the whole idea of survival horror by having to scavenge and conserve your resources. It also makes the game more realistic in its environment. For example, in Resident Evil 2, the police department has plenty of guns, ammo, and weapons scattered around. In Silent Hill, there are weapons that make sense for the location, such as having a gun in the police station and a wooden plank near a dumpster. Now let's talk about full vulnerability and what I mean by full vulnerability. When I say full vulnerability, I mean the player is completely unarmed and defenseless throughout most of the game, or at least in the beginning. Adding this realistic aspect to horror games bumps up the genre from horror to survival horror. Realistic aspects such as randomly stumbling across guns in a house inhabited by a murderous family make sense, or even finding guns in a police station, as I stated before. Finally, it's time to touch on the element of puzzles and puzzle solving. Elements like this make the survival horror genre unique and is one of the main reasons I enjoy the game so much. Most of the puzzles in the Resident Evil franchise make sense in their environment. Things such as having multiple door locks or different keys to each door in an older abandoned mansion gives it the feeling that the player is unwelcome. Puzzles should be deemed hard based on the difficulty of the game mode. I like how some games in this genre generally keep the same puzzle for each game mode but with slight tweaks such as a hint or making some other form of making it easier. An example of having puzzles be more of a focus in a game would be in Silent Hill. While the game does have enemies you can fight and defeat, overall you usually don't have the means to do so. In my playthrough of Silent Hill, I barely knew where I was going, let alone where to find the strongest weapons to kill off the chance straggler. The main boss battles are added as a means to add to the story as well, and are not just there to be there. Resident Evil also follows this formula, but in a different way. On higher difficulties, items are harder to come across, causing the player to think critically on whether or not to kill a zombie, or to just leave it be. A lot of enemies in these sorts of games can usually be avoided, but at the risk that they harm you later in the game. During my run of the original Resident Evil, I was following a walkthrough so I can find every spare healing item I can get my hands on. This is solely because I am bad at video games and will die and have to restart if I'm not babied. Which is also the case for a lot of people in these genres, considering that the whole horror aspect adds to just people being scared in general, making it harder for them to think rationally about their decisions. So basically, any good game, but specifically a good horror game, will make you feel like you're totally immersed into the game, like you're actually Leon Kennedy fighting zombies to save the world. Elements such as limited items, vulnerability, and complex puzzles add to this immersion. You need a good story to keep your players hooked, and of course the game needs to be somewhat horror based. I hope this video gives a good look into what my views of a survival horror game is, and sprinkles in a bit of my own ideas as well. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and comment, maybe, and subscribe. This will probably be the last video of the year and will be uploaded after my yearly wrap up I just started doing as I'm writing the script. So go watch that if you're interested. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and goodbye.